mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon.
I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited Podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings. Joining us today once again is John Pollmann. John, welcome back to the show.
Hey Chris, great to be back with you.
John is a regular contributor to Ducks Unlimited magazine, ducks.org, and of course the podcast here. And I brought John on today to talk about something that a lot of waterfowl hunters are out doing right now. This is something that's timely, and hopefully this little conversation will help people with that early Canada goose action. These early season hunts can be fantastic. I grew up doing them. It was one of my favorite hunts of the year. John, I know you take advantage of this as much as possible, but you put together a couple different articles, and we've just kind of got one that we pulled up here. But just tips for those early season Canadas.
Yeah, they're a fun bird to hunt. It's one of the, we've had opportunities here in South Dakota where I live for the last probably 20 some years since we started the early September season for the birds. I actually have opportunities now in August as well for them. That's, it's kind of the first way to kick off the season for hunters in this part of the country, and they're a lot of fun. They can be frustrating. I think it's gotten a little bit harder over the years to hunt them. It seems like they've kind of adapted a little bit, but they sure are a fun bird to hunt. And like I say, it's just a great way to kick off the fall hunting season.
Yeah, and usually with some of these earlier seasons, there's pretty liberal limits, mainly because a lot of what you're hunting there is some residential birds, maybe some molt migrants, things like that. But really, a lot of those early, especially August, are almost like resident. That's what I grew up hunting in Indiana, and I know they do it here in Tennessee a little bit, and in most states have like that early resident hunt. So some of those tactics do change. Like you said, they're adapting a little bit, even from back when you started doing it. What has changed the most, for your approach to these early season geese?
The early season honkers here they are not always a very social bird. They are still in family groups. They become harder to decoy, because I think they have become maybe even less social. And there are exceptions to this, every season where you line it up just right and you put the herd on them, like you did back in the old days. But I think that's one of the things that has changed, is that I think that they're not super social early in the year. They're hanging out in family groups, and so they don't decoy like they would. You can't manipulate them with decoys and calling quite like you do later in the year. And I just think that aspect of it has gotten a little bit harder. But that, the reality of that situation kind of impacts how you hunt the birds early in the year, just in terms of their small group, not social status. There are some things that you can do to kind of target them because of those habits early in September, early in the year.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned that in this article, where not necessarily saying that they're less social, but one of the most important factors in that with birds that are less social and is scouting, kind of being right where they want to be. So you're not relying on them necessarily decoying. I mean, you can use that, but really being very effective with your scouting, it will pay dividends here.
Absolutely. I don't know if there is a more important time to be on the X from beginning of the season to the end of the season here in South Dakota, where I hunt, quite frankly, anywhere up here in the upper Midwest, up in the Northern Plains. There's probably no more important time to be on the X than these early season Canada geese. Being off by 15, 20, 25, 30 yards even can have a huge impact on the birds being in shooting distance, centering you up, being in range. So it is vitally important that when you are scouting them, that you figure out exactly where they are. And so, one of the things that we do is when we find a field with birds, we get permission on the field. We get permission to go out, drive a vehicle out in the field. We let the birds, the night before we're going to hunt, we let the birds leave on their own. Just keep your distance. Don't scare them out of there. Let them leave on their own. and then drive out and find the freshest feathers and, goose droppings that you can, and then leave something in the field, whether it's a utility flag or a 5-gallon bucket or an old cooler, whatever it is, so the next morning exactly where to go. Because like I say, if you're off the X a little bit, those birds are habituated to being in a certain spot in that field, and they aren't always willing to decoy or, allow you to manipulate them with a flag or calling or decoys. They're going to land where they want to land. So if you were exactly where they want to be, your odds for success just go up that much more.
Absolutely. I ran into that last year. Just kind of a quick little side story. I was hunting in northern Minnesota. It was late September, early October. Their season had just opened. And these are early season birds. They're practically residents up there. We set up in a rye field. Decoys out, guys calling, we got layout blinds brushed, and we had probably the first 2 or 3 flocks of the morning just landed like 110 yards right in front of our decoys, right out in front of them. And so they're completely out of range, and there's nothing worse than those first few flocks landing on the X and you're 100 yards off the X, because guess what the next few flocks are going to do? They're going to go right with that first flock that landed. So we had to sit there and watch geese land in front of us out of gun range for like an hour before they finally bounced out, and then we caught some birds later in the morning. But being on that X in that early season is really, really important.
Yeah, it can turn into a really frustrating morning when you're off.
Yeah.
And it really can. And so, like I say, put a priority on making sure those birds want to be, and then that's where you set up.
Absolutely. And now decoys. Decoys is something that, especially with goose hunters, it appears to be more and more and more, always seems to be better. But in your article, you kind of mentioned that more is not really better in this case.
Not necessarily. No, I think you keep it pretty realistic. If you've got a certain number of birds that are using the field, I wouldn't use any more decoys than that. It's something where, and again, like I say, there are exceptions to this. Folks that are listening may say, well, I did this, I put out twice as many and it worked. There are exceptions to it, but by and large, my experience is that, I don't want to overload the field early in the season for honkers, because it just doesn't seem to work. So we're really trying to use a realistic number, and then also realistic positioning of the decoys as well. Family groups that, maybe you group these decoys in family groups that give you pockets of shooting areas, not necessarily one shooting hole out in the front of your blinds, but maybe a number of different possible landing zones for those birds. Again, because they don't act the way that later season Canada geese do. And so to keep things realistic in terms of how you place your decoys and how many you put out there, and that's just seemed to work for us pretty well here in the past.
Yeah, and I think, doing this in Indiana growing up, we tried to make it look almost like family grouping. So even if we were using 3 or 4 dozen decoys, which felt like even a lot, we were spreading those out. So you've got 8 here, 13 here. You're spreading these into little clumps and kind of family groups to make them look like a separate flock, but all one, big decoy spread. And I think that's a good thing to remember, especially in the early season as well. This time of year, these birds sometimes are not, you mentioned it a couple times, they're not nearly as vocal. What about the calling aspect of this?
I've talked to a lot of guys about early season honkers over the years. One that comes to mind is Tony Vandemore in Missouri. In terms of calling, one of his tips is that, he leans really heavily on the scouting and being on the X. And I think he limits his calling for these early season birds, does not overcall at them, because again, it doesn't seem to be something that works well for them. If you're in the right spot, you've done your scouting, chances are you're just not going to need to do as much calling. Obviously, birds are leaving if they're flared off, or if they, if something's not quite right in their mind and they're starting to leave. Well, then by all means, what do you got to lose? You get after them with a call and lay it on pretty heavy. But, I can think of a number of times hunting early season honkers where I see the line of birds out in the distance. We may give a wave of the flag, and some clucks and some honks just to make a little bit of noise. But if they are on a line for the decoys in that field, I'm quiet. I'm not saying a single thing until they do something that tells me that they need to hear they need some help. They need to hear something, and then we'll make some noise. But if they're on a line and they're coming at me, I'm not going to get in their way. And again, it just seems like that has worked really well in the past. I love calling as much as the next guy, but I love more putting birds on the ground. And so, I'll put the call down if I don't need to. And it seems to work. Don't call if you don't need to.
Yeah. I did a piece for the magazine a couple years back where kind of early season Canada goose. And I talked to Field Hudnall, world champion goose caller. And he's like, yeah, I don't call. So that kind of just shows, these guys who are, world champion goose callers and take it in the early season. And he's putting all of his emphasis, like you said, on scouting, being in the right field, having your decoys in the right spot that look natural, but he's really not putting any emphasis on calling. Now, he says he will, like you said, there's certain situations, birds kind of bailing out or things like that.
Or even after the shot, Chris, in all honesty, if you shoot into a flock of birds, if you're dealing with, young birds that are confused, maybe don't know what's going on, if you lay it on afterwards, sometimes you can call those birds back around for another opportunity, but when it comes to guys like Field and Tony and those guys that are true pros at what they do, I think, and this is something that is appropriate for hunting situations throughout the year, is that they are just observant. They're watching the birds, and they're not going to do something just for the sake of doing it. They'll try it, and if it's not working, they're gonna do something different. And sometimes that means not calling at all. But they really are paying attention to what the birds are telling them to do, and that works for September honkers, and it works for December mallards as well.
Now, the next aspect of this, and this is interesting because when you wrote this piece, this is from a long time ago. Just reading it, I could tell, like, oh man, this is old. But what the cool part about this is things have changed so much as far as blinds, portable blinds. We did an entire podcast, last season or 2 seasons ago, where we just talked about blinds, and we could probably do another one this year because there's so many new different variations. But for this early season, what are you kind of looking for in a blind?
So it goes back to one of the first things we talked about, which is being on the X. When we're here in South Dakota and, other areas with early season, honker seasons, the availability of food at that time of the year is pretty limited in terms of the food type. South Dakota, we're talking small grains, whether that's wheat stubble or oats or things along those lines. It could be silage, which is corn that's been chopped very low to the ground. It could be alfalfa stubble. It could be, in other words, these are areas that sometimes have very, very, very little cover to work with. So my go-to blind, for this time of the year, this is different from other times of the year, but in September, my go-to blind is still going to be that layout blind because it's going to give me the lowest profile in an area that may not have a lot of cover. One of the things that we will look for, within the area of the X, we know the area where the birds are going to be. We'll still maybe look for areas of a little bit taller stubble or taller corn stalks, or maybe a small depression to get that blind even down lower in the ground. It's something where you want to do everything you can to reduce the outline of that blind. Another great thing, though, probably my favorite way to hunt them this time of year, though, is utilizing standing cover that's in the area near the X, particularly silage fields. That is a great way to stay hidden. Silage fields, a lot of times a landowner or a farmer will cut only a portion of the field. And so you've got standing corn and then this really short chopped corn right next to it that the birds are feeding on. And so utilize that standing cover if you can. It's a heck of a lot easier to hide in standing corn than it is in a blind out in that silage field. I know folks that that will hunt fields that have bales. Maybe the farmer has baled up the stubble, whether it's wheat or oats or whatever, and they'll utilize the bales to hide. I know some hunters for early season that will still use an A-frame or some sort of a panel blind situation in a field, especially maybe if there is some taller cover in the field. You can make it look something similar to whether it's a rock pile or a bale, a straw, or whatever it is. it's kind of one of those things where you just see what works, and if it doesn't work one day, switch it up and try something next for another hunt. But again, my go-to this time of the year is still going to be that layout just because of its profile. And I know that I can get exactly where those birds want to be.
Yeah. And it's funny thinking about that. This early season is really, it's a unique time for hunters and blinds, because it seems like this early season, people are a lot more opportunistic about cover. Like you said, people are hiding behind hay bales. And, for some reason, I just don't see people doing that during like the regular season, a late season hunt. They're just not, they would set up another, way to get in the field, or have a A-frame, or even a, low profile layout, something like that. But I feel like in the early season, maybe it's just because people's mindsets just aren't dead set on it yet. I don't know. It just seems like it's a very unique time of year for the way hunters approach staying hidden.
Oh, for sure. For sure. There are things that we do in September that we would never do later in the year, from just, and some of it's just a practicality. It's logistics of it. Later in the season, there aren't a lot of bales left in the fields up here where I hunt. We're not dealing with green alfalfa, grassing out our layout blinds with green alfalfa. Those are things that you only typically do in September because of just the way how early it is in the season. But, you do what you need to do to stay hidden. If you need to make use of a panel blind, you do that, natural cover, fence line, whatever it may be. But again, going back to the first thing, make sure that whatever blind you're using, whatever situation, be as close to that X as possible.
Yeah. Kind of a funny story. When I was hunting in high school, we'd do early season hunts, and we'd hunt before school. And you could get, 45 minutes in before going into school, like a quick 45-minute hunt. And we had some places where we knew geese were going to be. And a buddy of mine that was older, he kind of hunted with us, he gave me these Canada goose shells that were like, each one of them was like 5 feet long and 4 feet wide. I mean, do you remember those? I don't remember what they were called. Oh, and they had foam on the bottom so you could float them. I mean, the heads were, like 2 footballs together. They were just massive. And so me and my buddies, we would know where these geese are going, and we would go out there and we'd throw out these 8 big shells, and we would lay underneath them in the middle of a field. I mean, cut low bean field or whatever it was, and we would lay underneath massive decoys, and man, it was effective too. But again, we would never do that during the regular season. Like, we never even thought about doing that. Once things got colder and the birds started doing different things, it was like, we're not doing that. But it was so successful during the early season, probably like you said, young birds, different time of year, things like that. But that just dawned on me when you're talking about hiding in unique ways. I was like, yeah, we used to lay under these we called them brontosaurus geese, because they looked like, they were so big. It was like, why would they even fall for these? But they did.
I remember them. And while we're sharing 2 quick stories, the very first early goose season I had, was a alfalfa field. It had been cut, and the birds have been up in this alfalfa field munching on the necks, the regrowth. And this is way before layout blinds. This is way before anything like that.
We're dating ourselves here, John.
Oh, I know. I've been around this game for a while. And we use burlap sacks that we try to like stuff the alfalfa into the burlap sack, and we just laid that on top of us. And I used floater decoys that I balanced up on top of some of the standing alfalfa. Didn't have a field decoy to my name at that point, and we still shot birds. Not a ton of them, but we got a few. And then, one of the first really successful Canada goose hunts I had, an early season hunt, was one of those goose chairs where it was like a little, cot that had a giant decoy on the top of it that you flipped up. And, it worked. We, shot a boatload of birds that day. And a lot of that, though, I think just comes down to being in the right place at the right time, doing the work scouting and being where the birds want to be. But a lot has changed since you and I started this game.
Yeah, that's right. And so, that kind of leads us into our next conversation is, what are some specific gear? And we can probably skip through blinds right now because we just did it. But, any other Canada Goose, early season Canada Goose specific gear that, people should probably look for?
I know this is one that's in the back of your mind, and it's one thing that we do use here in South Dakota too. Early season is a thermocell mosquito repellent. We'll just clip it to the back of the blind. That time of year, there's a lot of dew in the cover. Mosquitoes can be really, really, really bad, and so we'll use those just to make life a whole lot easier. Always bring a flag for honkers early season, really throughout the year. It's one of the things that we want to have along. I know we said that don't always use them a lot, but calls are still something you should have with you. Making sure that you have a way to make some noise if you need to. In terms of shotgun and shot shell, I have been using the 20 gauge the last few years for just about everything, and that includes honkers. My goal is to have those in, within 30 yards. And so that's the gun that I've been using, and have had really good success with it. But it's one of those things where use what you know. If there's a gun that you like for ducks, use it for honkers. But like I say, my choice has been that 20 gauge. Outside of that, decoy type, I think you can, obviously I shot them with floaters, 25 years ago, but it's, decoy type, I think you can use just about whatever you have, whether that's silhouettes or shells or full bodies. Just again, using a realistic number and realistic location. There's not a ton of stuff that goes into an early season Canada goose hunt. Anything come to your mind, Chris, that I didn't mention?
No, I mean, I think you pretty much covered decoy wise. I mean, it's an open, opportunity there. I mean, you can go with silhouettes. You can do a mix of, a couple dozen silhouettes and maybe, 6 full bodies. I've seen spreads like that work really well in the early season. I know everyone's kind of pushing towards that full body game. But getting full bodies out to a field sometimes can be a problem. So don't be afraid to, use other opportunities. You were talking about calls, and I was just talking about those old, shells that we're hiding under the big brontosaurus geese. And I was thinking, I was like, man, I don't remember calling much, but I remember the calls that we used, and this would have been in the mid 90s, early 90s. And I used to have one of those big river flutes. You remember those?
Mm-hmm.
They're like,
oh yes, 16
inches long. This thing was, I found that in my office the other day and I put it on my shelf. I was like, oh my God, that was like almost before people were really into those short reed goose calls. Everyone that I knew had one of those flutes, that's what we all use. But, you get that real loud honk out of them. Those things were fantastic.
Absolutely. I had one myself. I still have it hanging on a lanyard at home. And it obviously, a short reed goose call is much more versatile. You can make a lot more noise, different kinds of calls with it. But, those, we still killed geese back in the day using those calls. It's like you say, a lot has changed, but, I use that same call myself and shot birds with it. So
I think the only piece of gear that I would probably add in here is, maybe 2. One, binoculars. You're going to need that for scouting. And like you said, to get right on the X, that's always good to have. Driving around, keep your binoculars handy, but also a cooler. And I say this because we've had some early season hunts in Indiana that were pretty hot. And, you put 15, 20 birds down in some of these resident hunts where you can shoot 5 per day in some states, something more in others. I think South Dakota was like 8, wasn't it?
15.
Oh, geez. Yeah. So you've got a mess of geese laying around, and the weather's warm. You don't want those birds to spoil. I remember a few years back we did one and we just threw a couple coolers in the back of the truck and a couple bags of ice in the cooler so that we could, as soon as we got done, we started processing those geese because next thing, it's warm enough, you got flies and bees and, everything coming out. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you don't want those birds to just sit in the back of your truck, those things will spoil pretty quick when it's 80 degrees outside.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris. That's a great point. Something absolutely to think about what you're gonna do with the birds after you get them. Making sure you have a plan in place when it's hot, for sure.
Yep, that's awesome. Well, John, this has been great. It's been a great little kind of discussion on early season geese. I think that's where most people's mindset are. I've heard some rumblings even around the office here about some guys working on, some early resident hunts here in Tennessee. I know my buddies up in Indiana will be hitting them pretty hard. And I'm sure you guys are almost getting ready to be at the beginning of your regular season here. So not too far from it anyway.
Yeah, actually, our August management take just started just this last weekend for Honkers. I didn't get out here this last weekend, but I've got my eye on some birds here locally around. And so we are, from now until February, able to shoot Canada geese in South Dakota. So game on. It started.
Game on. Yep. And 15 per day in this early season, you're going to have to bring an extra pickup truck.
Yeah, if I'm that lucky to shoot 15, that is true, yeah.
Gosh, that's a lot. Well, cool, man. This has been great, and I appreciate you coming on again.
Thanks, Chris. Absolutely. Anytime.
I'd like to thank my guest, John Pollmann, for joining us today and talking about early season Canada goose hunting. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for just being awesome and getting the show out to you guys. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the DU podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks. Stay tuned to the Ducks.